All right, guys. So remember last Tuesday, or remember Tuesday, we were talking about the emergence of free black communities and what that meant to the African American experience. We talked about these free black communities will give us an understanding of how blacks will take whatever they can and they will create great organizations and great institutions that will be very important for the black community moving forward. So we will see factors of where they will utilize right the factors of why they were forming. They were forming because whites were not allowing them in their institutions. And so from that we get the early organizations that create these mutual aid societies. And these mutual aid societies will be so important because they will begin to help create black banking, black organizations that could deal with creating schools and church organization. And all of these things are so important. And so many of the free black societies at this point were only admitting men, and women would have to open or create their separate organizations. And many of them will tie themselves to the Christian moral character, and you will begin to see more of the uh, Freemasonry organizations and so forth and so forth. Here's Prince Hall, which is the black uh, founder for black Freemasonry, because there is a difference between white organizations and black organizations. Typically, they do not form together. Everybody has their separate organizations. But I think some today are trying to change that, but there are different ideologies as it relates to Freemasonry. Also, with the origins of the independent black, the mutual aids, and remember the moral character, is the independent black churches. At the moment of the Great Awakening, it spawned the biracial churches, but many of the black churches will begin to become independent because the white organizations will not embrace the independence of these black churches. So, led by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, they will create the oldest African American church, which is the AME, African Methodist Episcopal. Right? So we will see where black churches will find themselves within the emergence of the free black communities. And we got to understand the importance of church, not just from a religious standpoint. Church will be the epicenter of the black community. This is where you will understand social issues, political issues, economic issues, or solutions. And so the black church is more than just going and praising God. It will become the fabric of American thought or black American thoughts. And so these future or these leaders, these early leaders like Richard Allen and Jones will be in the forefront of abolishing slavery. And they will do it from the pulpit. And so here's the first black school. With these first black schools, very difficult because it costs money, and a lot of the free black communities were not making a lot of money. And so some of the free black schools will be funded by white Quakers. And those schools will be called like the free African schools. And those schools will create, and you'll see those schools, some of those schools in like a New York, Baltimore, and even in Philadelphia. The one in New York will create several black intellectuals that will go on to do great things. But once they get to a certain point, they will have to go to Europe and study because America will not uh, educate the black community. And so violence and efforts to suppress these schools would happen. So we get prominent leaders: Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, Jupiter Heyman, Daniel Coker, John Chavis, and Lemuel Haynes. These are individuals that will be instrumental in the free black communities. See, African American entrepreneurs would be like Prince Hall was an entrepreneur, Peter Williams and James Fortan. So these are the free black people. And the reason why they were free is because they had an economic interest. So leaders often disagreed on what was best for the African Americans. A lot of them will condemn slavery, but were not activists. You will get like Allen Jones and Hall and Fortan, who believed in the principles of the revolution, would prevail if black people insisted on liberty. So we'll see a lot of these things. At the same time, the American Colonization Society will organize and influence white Americans to convince no place in the United States for free African Americans. And Daniel Coker will lead the first party of 86 Africans to go to Africa in a new colony called Liberia in West Africa. And we will see like a Paul Cuff, who will be a major black advocate for the migration back to Africa. We will also see slave uprisings like led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. And this enslaved black people to the freedom of the San Domingo. And this bloody struggle will end in 1804, and many white planters fled north with their slaves. What is interesting is once the Haitian Revolution happens, that's when America has the opportunity to buy the Louisiana Purchase for a fairly reasonable price, because Napoleon now is at his wit's end and has lost more wars at this point and is on the brink. Matter of fact, France will arrest him and send him away until his death. He'll escape and try to come back again, but eventually he'll get caught and end up dying in exile. Also, the Haitian Revolution will spawn some American slave plantations to also think about revolting, which was to the slave masters scary. They knew about that, and they didn't want the slaves to get that type of information because they may get the same idea. And so we will see one black unrest in Virginia, a Louisiana rebellion in 1811, Desalone. Haitians and the slave drivers initiated a revolt. White Southerners rejected the Enlightenment values. They feared a race war. They feared emancipation would encourage that war. They were determined to make the black bonders stronger. So they outlawed the assembly of slaves because they would say that the slaves are conjuring up something. That's where we get the concept that you hear. If there's 3 or more black folks together, oh, y'all conjuring up something to attack somebody. That's where that thought process comes from. Comes from this era. They will place a curfew on the slaves and free black people. At one point, when they were issuing manumission, now it's a lot more difficult to, which was to set them free, because in their mind they kept remembering that fear that if they get free, they are going to do us the way we did them. And that thought has always been in the back of their minds. And so the fear of the northern white abolitionist influence on slaves, and it became suspicious of outsiders. By the time the War of 1812, this is the war that the British will finally leave America. And in this war is what they consider the second revolution between the United States and Britain. And America won this war as well. But by the 1820s, the drawing of who are free states and what are slave states will be drawn by an imaginary line. And this imaginary line is called the Missouri Compromise. And that line is right here. This line will divide at this juncture, 36 and 30 degrees north latitude, that anything above, free states. Anything below, slave states. But they wasn't thinking about Texas about to come in, California, and all of this land. All of this land is about to be added. Hasn't been added yet. And so in conclusion, I would say this, that Northern emancipation contrasts with a strong Southern racist ideology and slavery made the difference between the North and the South. But the attitudes in the North won't be great. Free blacks in the North won't experience this great life. They will be met with a lot of limitation. And so as black urban communities arise in the North and the Upper South and even in the Deep South, it will create new opportunities for education and spiritual expression in Black church. It will also help economic growth, but most of the African Americans will remain slaves. And the white Southerners will want a permanent black bondage. Permanent. But it's going to lead to where they have to decide, and they're going to have to fight for that. And that's the Civil War. Thank you, guys.